Okay, class is now recording. All right, so today we're going to be learning about lurking. Lurking is a really fun strategy that a lot of people tend to do, but there's a lot of ways that you could do this wrong. And we're going to be covering in just a moment the different things that you can do, the agents that you can use, and all the exceptions, as well as some guidelines that might be really useful for figuring out whether you should be lurking or not. So yet again, we're going to be looking at different things such as the role, what it entails, who can use it, who can do this, who could potentially do this. After all, it's a different game when you play it in ranked. And then we're going to be looking at the different types of lurking, the 2 types, and then I'm going to be then working with you guys to figuring out whether it's the best time to lurk or not. So the first thing with lurking is we need to understand what it is. Okay, lurking is just the act of playing quiet. It's to play away from your team, to break off in order to catch a moment of weakness, to maybe get an enemy off guard, or maybe potentially get space for free. It is mostly an attacker-sided play. If you guys are curious about seeing how you could do it on defense, we can do that a completely different class, but it's pretty straightforward. Most of the time, a defender tends to lurk. It's in part with a flank, and they tend to just do it by just kind of like staying off away from the team, holding an angle, deep in enemy territory. So it's not really too particularly complex when an enemy defender does it, but there's a lot of complexity when an attacker does it. There's a lot of reasoning for it. But with that out of the way, right, there are a lot of viewpoints on lurking, but most of them are like tilt related. The slight tilt factor usually comes from the way that people tend to lurk. There's some perfect examples of how people get angry at this legitimate strategy. In order to be a good lurker, you need to be quiet, hide in the shadows. There's some people that are going to start calling it impact fragging if you're doing it way too often. But usually it's just kind of like a mockery of quote unquote their lack of impact in the game, right? So there is a term that people have coined for this type of play style, and it really just encapsulates just being like a rat, right? You just have to hide in corners. You just must embrace the way of the rat, okay? But you need to understand that despite the fact that it might have a negative, there's negative viewpoints around it, lurking is a really effective way of infiltrating space, okay? It is a great way of catching the enemy off guard. It's a great way of poking holes in the enemy strategy and gain picks while they're being vulnerable, okay? Being a rat is good sometimes, okay? So we're going to be looking into that. All right. So as I mentioned, with the rats and the lurks, there's a huge tricky point that must be balanced. Okay. Most of the time, the reason lurks and ratting can be done wrong, or you could be flamed for it, it is because of your choice of agent. And looking at the little thing that we have right here, right? There's certain roles that fit really well with it. We have players like controllers, and most of the time you can see that they're mostly universal controllers, the ones that can use smokes far away from their team, or they can still use their abilities despite being away from their team, or sentinels that are not really useful for entry, but they can still fulfill other roles aside from just helping the enemy, just prevent them, from flanking, right? So normally when you're looking at agents like these, you can see that their role is not really rigid. It's not just about them controlling the map with smokes. It's not just about controlling the map with flanks. They can still do a lot more. But these are the characters that tend to be the best candidates for map control, right? However, like someone just asked, what about Yoru? Well, before we get into that, let's understand just the 3 different ways in which we can look at how an agent might potentially be able to lurk. Let's look at the first example. So this is on Breeze. Viper drops down their wall and decides to play away. Okay, taking a different lane to pressure the enemy can be a really good way of making the opponent look for you. They can try to flush you out, and it pressures them, okay? And they take a risk by not looking for you. And this is one of the best ways of taking enemy information away simply by not being there presently, right? It might force the opponent to play a little bit more spread out, and that also might help your team not have a full 5 versus 4 against them on site. Okay, so this is the first example of how lurking could be really useful for you. You can use it as a way to take away enemy information. You can use it as a way of pressuring them into not being fully from them not fully rotating onto a site. So you can use this as a way of essentially helping your team despite not being there, right? So there's some positives to it. Another example could be looking at range. Okay, so in this example, we have Omen pushing in a different lane, like we saw with the Viper, but they're still in range to be able to help their team. Range is an important aspect of lurking. Okay, most of the time I see that people tend to not play around that range or play way too far, or they don't really consider when they need to stay within range. And this is where most lurks tend to be done incorrectly. This is where people tend to have those quote unquote impact frags, right? They really are providing nothing of substance. They're just staying for way too long without helping their team, right? Obviously not all the time. This doesn't have to be applicable all the time, but if you're someone that has some form of range, you need to play according to it, okay? If your character is still vital for the entry, you should still be nearby and you should still be able to help them be around. How long is too long? It's not necessarily how long is too long, it's just you timing with your team. If I am Omen and I am playing way too close to A main and I'm pushing in while everybody else is pushing B main and I'm providing no smokes, then I stayed too long, too far away, right? But if I know that they're about to enter and I come back in order to help them out, then it doesn't matter how long I stay over there, as I can still provide smokes for them, right? So it's not a matter of like how long is too long, it's whether you consider how much you can help your team in that meantime. So like I said, you need to play your range. If you're at a range of your utility, you're offering nothing, okay? You might as well just be breaking off. You might as well be DC'd during that particular entry point, okay? You might as well just be like, oh, I'm gonna go AFK. My Uber is here, right? Like you can do something like that while they're entering and it would be the equivalent of what just happened, okay? You need to make sure you're still there. You make sure you're still impactful during that period. The last one, of course, you need to look at how range works in terms of controlling lanes, okay? Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that all characters can do this. Same thing with the way that Viper can break off, the same way that Omen can break off, right? Some characters need to stay around a particular area, and then there's some benefits of breaking off from the team. You can control multiple lanes and have multiple pieces of information controlling the map. Range and flank watch can work together, and they can provide as much information and control as much space for your team. This gives your team a lot of breathing room. So for example, we have KJ playing around this little Venn diagram, allowing her to not only being able to control anybody that's trying to kind of maybe sneak out of tree, but also anybody that might be potentially trying to sneak out. Of course, it's a really flimsy form of control. It's very indirect. You can still shoot these pieces of utility with no consequence because no one's going to be playing off of them. But knowing the information gives your team some form of reaction. Hey, we are going to fail a push, but at least we know where they are. We can take our time in getting this piece of space, right? It's something where your team is now able to use this information and get a little bit more breathing room. Because too often than not, I see players, all 5 of you pushing down the same lane, or maybe just splitting a 2 and 3, and you guys having no clue what's going to happen if you fail this push. And sometimes you guys have no backup plans. That's why we talked a little bit about those backup plans. This is one way that a flank can help you. A flank watch can help you identify whether you can still have some sort of control. And this is what I mean when I was talking about that space making class too, right? If you still have some of this control somewhat in your grasp, then you can use it for future plans. Okay, so now I'm going to answer that question about what about your. Okay, this is the part that could get me in trouble. Because not everything goes according to plan. Not everything is going to be perfect. If I did a team play class, there's still going to be some things that you're going to have to break away from, simply because a lot of you guys just play in ranked, okay? A lot of you guys are not on a team, and a lot of you guys might not see that cohesion ever just because of the rank that you're in, okay? In ranked, things don't go according to plan, and it's okay to be a little bit more selfish, okay? While it is true that you should be playing the right way and there's a particular way your character could be used, sometimes you have to break away from those norms to be a little bit more successful, okay? The agents that I just showed here are some examples of characters that can break the mold, and they can be used in a variety of different ways. It is recommended that you, of course, don't do that. Of course, you want to make sure that you still have these characters fulfill their role a little bit better. But you're going to notice that there's something about their kit that gives them an edge. For example, these two, if they win, they can heal up. I mean, you can say the same thing with Phoenix. Or they gave them some sort of advantage, some sort of edge that can keep them going, right? These are characters that are self-sufficient, they're duel-oriented, and you can use them to strike alone and maybe even catch an enemy by surprise. Because again, you could use a character like Skye, you could use a character like Sova, but at one point in time, it won't really be lurking, it's just you faking. And that basically becomes a little bit muddled and convoluted. If your plan is to essentially catch the enemy off guard while everybody else is making noise for you and you're not providing any help for entry, then you're just being quiet, you're just being a rat. So you have to make sure that you're balancing the way you're using your character. And we're going to talk about some particular guidelines that you can use to kind of see if your character is perfect for that one scenario or that situation. Okay. So there are 4 different things that you can kind of use to ask yourself those questions. Now, these characters right here could or could not be used. Now, I'm not going to say use Jet to lurk every single time. There's definitely scenarios where it does work. There's usually scenarios where it might potentially be good. But we're going to be looking at these questions and seeing how you can kind of use that. So, for example, am I needed on site? If you have a team where you have both a Yoru and a Jet, well, the Yoru can be on somewhere else and the Jet can help on entry, right? You don't necessarily have to use Yoru to entry. He could be useful, right? But he's definitely one of those characters that is a duelist, is really good for entry. Currently, I mean, the Cypher meta might start shaping away and shaving off a little bit, but while that was happening, he was an amazing entry. He was perfect on those maps that are currently on rotation, right? But maybe with a new map rotation, maybe with a new map pool, maybe Jet and Raze will start seeing a little bit more play, right? And you can see that he might not be as useful on site, or he might be useful elsewhere, right? So this is where you can start looking at, yeah, Yoru might be good for me to take a lurk. You can also play with flank. You can just kind of TP back. You'll be good to go. What? The same thing, you can move on to the next question. Is my role being fulfilled? Well, let's say for example, you're playing Yoru. Again, same thing. Let's say that your only help right now is being the flasher. Well, if somebody else is doing the flashes, and I'm sure that you could basically break off from the team and still have the same success, right? Am I the best fit for contesting flanks or space? This is a question that you're going to have to ask yourself, and this is where something like Jack comes in, right? Is your team basically defaulting a lot? Are you guys not really investing a lot of time in hits? Do you really need to use that a lot, right? I mean, yeah, of course, if you're defaulting, then you can obviously break off a little bit, look for more space. Since you are technically a space maker, you tend to contest a lot more space, then yeah, you would be like a perfect choice for that. If your team is defaulting, or there's really no play with that, or the Yoru feels like they can actually do the entry for you, then yeah, you might see some scenario, some niche scenario where your character should be good. I'm never going to encourage you to lurk on the Jet, but there's going to be times, like I said, there's just everybody defaulting, you breaking off a little bit, finding an opening, getting a couple kills, right? Am I being better off being traded? This is where I kind of add this part in, because if your character is not designed for lurking, if it's not designed for lurking and you're finding yourself dying a lot, whether it's in any fight, then it's probably better off for you to stick with the team. And this may seem a little bit backwards. You might be thinking, I shouldn't play with the team if I'm not doing too good. And the reason for that is a lot of players think that they can just do more good than harm while playing away from the team and just using that advantage to get picks. All you're essentially doing is baiting your team, because the lack of confidence can cause you to hesitate. I've seen it a lot. I've seen players in really good positions just whiff, and because they're not being traded, they're just a +1. Okay. So again, you can use these little guidelines right here to identify whether your character is good for it. Now, I think that Yoru is a good example of all of these things being fulfilled, right? The reason I added him in here, he's probably like a really good example of a lurk despite not being the right role for it, right? But then the other ones over here could potentially work. So maybe, for example, you could have Sage play on split. You can use her for entry, for example, but if she's not really needed on site, if someone else is doing the entering, like a Jet, or maybe you don't need it, maybe you don't really need all that much worry about like how much like space is being contested on side, but you notice that there's flanks, then maybe yeah, you instead of putting that wall on B on split, you can play on A, right? Maybe you're still doing fine on your own. You don't need to be traded, right? So these are things that you can kind of do to kind of identify your character. And then, of course, something like Sky. Again, you could do it. You could do it. These are the characters that are examples of the current meta where you could do it. I'm not going to say that you couldn't. These are guidelines that you should try to fulfill before asking that question. Okay, this is where I will ask if you guys have any questions, as we will be jumping
So,
off to the application aspect of things. Go for it.
so if you have a jet raise comp, so like say you got your team comp and we just replaced that or throw them out with raise, who would
Okay.
be the better person to have lurking if it was between the jet and the raise?
I'd say the Jet. I mean, if you think about it, the Jet is able to get out of those like really weird scenarios if they find themselves in a bad position. Whereas something like a Raze, like her entry satchels are a little bit more useful in that manner. But that could change. For example, the Jet is just really bad at taking the fight, but you're really good at navigating with satchels in 1v1 scenarios. Okay. So you definitely could use that. So it all depends on player skill, but I think in general you'll find the Jets will have it easier. Um, just kind of doing maybe the lurk. But at the end of the day, again, you need to also remember the difference between the lurk and the fake. If they're like making noise on their own, then they're more of a fake, which is perfectly fine, right? Because they're making a lot of noise, they're getting the team off guard. Can happen. But if they're just like staying quiet and looking for a pick, and maybe for example you're that Jet, um, you're probably going to be well enough because again you're self sufficient. Okay, but what about Clover Chamber? So we just kind of mentioned it, right? So they're not necessarily one of those characters that have all the range in the world. They definitely, if they break off, they need to be very mindful of how close they are to the team. But they're really good at fighting, right? If they fight and then they basically win, they're gonna be really self-sufficient to maintain to contain, to continue and maintain their HP up, right? So Clove is one of those characters that you definitely could because you have an edge with your kit when you're using it just to fight and get lurks. So you could. Okay, this is one of those things where you could. Um. So yeah, Clove, Chamber, both of those characters really fit in pretty well. Let's talk about the application. There are two types of lurking. Okay, and this is where all of those questions about how the character is going to be played, they're going to be answered a little bit better, just because of the different play styles that exist. Okay, so there's two types of lurking. There's aggressive and there's passive. Okay, both of these work hand in hand. As when you pick one, you might go with the other, and when you pick the other, you might understand why you shouldn't. Right. So there's different ways of understanding how lurking is done. So we're going to just cover the first one. So the aggressive lurking is using the team's noise, okay, to basically control the enemy space and then jump into enemy lines. Okay, you can use this form of lurking to essentially catch opponents off guard because you're trying to get as much as possible. It is high risk, high reward. Okay, these require less patience, and it's probably the ones that you're mostly aware of. They're the ones that you're probably the most used to. Okay, when you're lurking, you might do with the intent of catching enemies off guard and getting kills. You're essentially forcing your way to get a kill. Okay, these are the types of plays where you'll find yourself way away from the team, or you're doing with the intention of playing way away from the team because you're using your team's push as a lure. You're using your team's push as a distraction, as a diversion, while you're getting a pick or two. Okay, and while you're playing in this type of play style, you can kind of use it in a lot of different ways. If you want to use that lurking, like we mentioned with Viper, to maybe take some pressure off, you can instead alert the opponent towards you by looking at maybe, for example, killing rotators, taking space that is necessary. So, for example, controlling some sort of mid that allows your team to be a little bit more aware of what's happening in their side of the map. Okay, you can look for things like maybe, for example, using trigger discipline to catch an opponent off guard, but then letting them live to get bigger prey, right? You can use things like that in order to be able to use your team's push to your advantage. Now, aggro lurkers are usually successful if they create enough pressure on their own to help their team. So this can be in the case of, for example, if you're breaking off and you're getting a lot of space, you can start destroying utility on your way, right? You can do this with the intention of maybe breaking off a trip and maybe destroying some utility from a sentinel, something like of the sort. Or maybe, for example, catching a rotator. Okay, again, you don't have to use trigger discipline. You don't have to look for bigger prey. But at the end of the day, you are essentially going to be very aggressive in the way that you're taking space with the intention of making them know that you are there, right? It's one of those things where you will get if you get the chance, you'll do it, right? There's a little bit less hesitation in regards to whether you should get the kill or not. You're just doing it with the intention of getting as much space as possible. And this is when it turns from just a normal lurk into a flank, because you can reach their backside really, really quickly, again, with the intention of getting a lot of kills. And that's basically the playstyle that a lot of you guys are really familiar with. Okay, high risk, high reward. However, there's a secondary type of playstyle. This is the one that I see a little bit. I see it less often in ranked. You might see it a lot more in an actual game. But the whole point of passive lurking is instead to use the push, to use the noise, to instead gather information so your team has a better idea of how to play. You can see this as it being a little bit less impactful because it kind of is, but there are some things that you can do to make it a little bit more impactful, because the whole point of passive lurking is not just information, it's not just gathering information, but it could be used to weaken a site or weaken a lane of some sort, right? So this is the one that you might potentially be more aware of yourself. We'll see. But the main difference is essentially how deep you go into the enemy territory. So what you'll see from this example right here, you'll notice that they're not really crossing this A main, right? Like they can go up to here maybe, but then they can retreat right away. Maybe the position that I showed you guys on that KJ example, that's also another example of how far they can go without having to cross into enemy lines, right? Most of the time when you're looking at characters like these, you would look at characters that usually have a lot of more utility that they can use, or they have something to gain. So for example, KJ could be playing here with the intent of maybe catching the Cypher off, maybe breaking a trip and getting her ult, right? She can do a lot in this entire scenario, but while she's gathering this utility, while she's making all this noise on her own, while the entire team is pushing and creating that pressure, right? She can then leave, reconnect with the team, and use the value that she gained. Oh, Cypher's still on B. Oh, I caught the Cypher. There's no rotator. Oh, they don't have any backup plans. I saw they didn't have this. Oh, I have my ult, right? You can provide a lot for your team simply by just weakening them on the other side or just getting that information, right? This is the most popular format that controllers and sentinels should be using, with the exception, of course, of Chamber. Chamber doesn't really have that much to really bring to the table. He should be using more aggressive lurks. I know someone was asking what type of playstyle you should be using, right? But most often than not, if you have a lot of utility that could still be used, so for example, KJ could still use lineups in this scenario, right, to keep their team still winning the push despite the fact that they have a terrible hold, right? You're looking at with the intention of essentially getting that and then leaving, right? You value your life just because of the amount of utility that you provide for your team. Okay. The biggest thing to keep in mind is that the passive players do get a little bit of a choice. So as attackers, they can't hesitate. They really can't. There are some times that you're going to look at the position you're in and maybe your IGL will bring you back. Okay. They might reel you in, but most often than not, you are just let loose and you're hoping to make as much damage as you can. However, passive lurkers, because they're playing so passive, because they're playing so quiet, and because they're not necessarily pushing into enemy lines, they can actually turn their passive lurk into an aggressive lurk, right? You're not really playing with the intention of going in, but if 3 players go in and you mow them down, then you have a choice, right? You have that idea of being able to play it into an aggressive play just simply because you have that opening right there, right? So this is generally done if your team prefers the space that you took. So let's say that this entire space has been gained right here, and they realize that they can't even break through A main despite making all this noise. Well, they can be like, well, you have all of B main. We're instead going to rotate into you, okay? If they prefer that space, they can use it, right? They can also tell you, hey, you've gotten some really good space. How about you keep going? And they start making more space. They start breaking into sight, right? They can start making more noise for you. And then you can use that to then transform your passive lurk into an aggressive lurk, right? Or more often than not, this is where you start looking at things like you gain a read. Oh, we realize that Cypher already rotated and sight is really empty. We can probably push up here because you know that if you all rotate, we can kind of catch them off in their spawn, right? That's one way of looking at it, right? Obviously, that's a really basic read, but any form of read is a good read, right? So in this scenario, you can look at this this type of play style and think, okay, we can kind of look at it as more of an opportunist type of style of play. So look at it that way. Understand that you can always transition from one to the other. You just have to be aware of what signs there are that makes you being able to play. And this might require your team to be okay with it a little bit, since you're basically baiting them just a tiny bit just so you can get information. But if they know, they're most often not going to be complaining about it. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the application. So the should I lurk is, we're going to be doing this kind of in a game. Okay, I'm going to be basically hoping that you guys get a little bit involved with this one. But these are questions that you guys can ask yourselves to figure out whether you should be lurking or not. Have you defaulted a lot? If you've defaulted a lot, they're going to be looking at every lane. Okay, how often have you lurked? If you did it like 2 times already, they're probably going to try to flush you out. Okay, do they flank? Is there any meaning to your flank watch? Right? If they haven't been doing it all that much, then maybe you can take a chance and not do it for one of them. Right? Have they taken any lanes prior? If this is kind of on the same idea as do they flank, but this is if they try to push out a particular lane aggressively. If you notice that they are an aggressive team, just that's something that you have to keep in mind, because this is what teams tend to do. They tend to play 4-1s just because they know the enemy team likes to take a lot of space, right? That means that you would have to adapt that way. How fast do they rotate? If you notice that they're really fast rotators, you can use that on one way or the next. If you know they're fast rotators, then you're probably going to be aware that they might not be in the flank, or you can use that to have an aggressive lurk and then catch a quick flank in their spawn. Do they have any anchors? Okay. Most often than not, that answer is yes. But this is where you're going to be using this entire checklist to see if this one point is good enough to overdo all the other no's, right? So most often not, yes, but keep in mind who is the anchor. And is your team self-sufficient? You know, do you have any round changing ults? Okay. These are just based on, yes, are you okay with being away from the team? Is your team okay with you being away from the team? Most of the time it's yes. But there's instances where the answer is no. Keep that in mind. And of course, there's some ults that might change. Okay. So let's look at this example right here. You're KJ in this scenario. Okay. You've struggled to hit sight for 3 rounds in a row, and now no matter what you seem to do, the enemy seems to understand what play you're going to be making, and they're always there. The team figures is because they like covering their sights and they tend to rotate really quickly. Okay. So what your team decides to say is like, hey, how about you stay back and you either control the flanks or try to lurk a little bit. Let's see if you can get a pick or maybe catch a late rotation for us to be able to rotate onto you. Okay. I need you guys to keep in mind, everyone here has their ults. Do you agree with the play that you should be lurking? And I want you guys to basically ask questions here. Use this as a guideline and ask me, do we default? And I'll say yes or no, and then you guys can say whether you should be lurking or not. Who wants to take it ahead? Who wants to try asking a question or seeing?
Wait, can you say that again?
So essentially, I want you guys to look at this questionnaire here, right here, and based on your situation, I want you to assess whether you should lurk or not. Like I said, you failed to push a site 3 times now. Okay, they seem to always have a read on you, no matter what you do. And there's always players on the rotation. There's always players over here, right? Like there's always going to be players on site. Your team says that you should break off and instead you should kind of lurk. Okay. You guys all have your ults right now. Okay. Your team is basically planning to do like a late rotation onto site. Do you agree with the play or not? And this is where you ask yourselves questions. So for example, if you guys were to ask me, do they default a lot? I would say you guys have not been defaulting at all lately. So that would be one answer to your questionnaire. These are things that are going to happen in your game. These are things that you have to apply in your game. And if anyone's still confused, essentially just ask me. And based on that and the answers that I give you, tell me if we should be lurking or not. Any takers?
I don't think we should have Killjoy lurk because they have ultimate.
Okay, that's one example of something you can use here. Okay, you shouldn't be lurking. We have the round changing ults. Okay, any other takes? Nobody. You guys are so nervous. Okay. Just for the sake of anybody as well, they might be rewatching for the sake of it. Okay. If you find that the enemy team is lurking, or you've noticed that they always like to quickly rotate, then you can probably use that lurk to your advantage. If they haven't been flanking and they're mostly rotating onto site, then you can probably use that to your advantage. Okay. Looking at asking questions like who the anchor is. If the anchor is no one special, and I can tell you someone like Phoenix, then you can probably take that risk, as they don't really have a good utility to catching an enemy off guard, and you can use that to your advantage, right? So that's what I would have said if you were to have asked that question. And then you can assess, well, Phoenix is the one that does it. I can probably take that fight, right? We can look at things like, is your team self-sufficient for being down one player? I mean, they all have ults. If they're in a pops their ult, then they should be fine on their own. But if they don't, then maybe not, right? Things like, do they flank? I could have said no, and then you can assess, well, maybe I can just use that to play aggressively, okay? And then you can look at how often have you lurked. I would have said 0 times. And then you can say, okay, there's enough of an opening for me to lurk if you wish, right? So because everybody has their ults, you can see that it can be a little bit convoluted, okay? So you can use that to your advantage. You can use that to your advantage. You can see how you basically assess your team. And then based on that, you can make a decision on whether you should or not. So for example, you made the decision because you have ult to not do it. And I think it's a perfectly okay play. Hey, I'm going to use my ult for this one first, and then I can lurk after, right? Use that to your advantage. Use these questions to your advantage to be able to make plays. Okay, so let's call it here. We're a little bit over time. Actually, no, we're perfectly on time. That's 30 minutes. Okay. Does anyone have any last few questions, or does anyone want to kind of see what we could do to help you guys understand the topic a little better? Any questions? Okay. The answer seems to be no. Everyone seems to be ready to scrim. All right, I'm going to start opening the game. All right, let's get started.